So we're going to discuss Require.js today, which is a module loader for JavaScript applications. The main goals of module loaders are to make your application faster by being able to do asynchronous loading of new code, and also to make it more organized by making it easier for you to break it up into individual files and modules that can be combined down the road for deployment or done as single files if you want to load functionality on demand. Require.js is a pretty popular implementation of this concept. The main developer of it used to work on the loader for Dojo, which is a big JavaScript library. And it draws a lot of inspiration from things like the common JS standard, which is what is used by Node. So if you've used the require statement in Node, that's common JS. But it's different than that in that it implements a standard called AMD, which is asynchronous module definition in the JavaScript community, which differs from common JS primarily in the sense that it's designed to work well in the browser by loading things over the network asynchronously instead of in a synchronous manner, meaning that everything else kind of stops while that new file is being loaded, like in Node.js, where that's not a big deal because you're on the server. So Require.js is really important as your application starts to grow so that you can keep track of what depends on what file needs to come after every other file, and so on, and just keep your code nice and clean. So we're going to start by looking, again, we're using this Fruit app we've been using to talk about Backbone throughout, and we're going to look at the code from our first Backbone session, and then we're going to look at how it changes to work with Require.js and what the advantages of that are. So this is our Backbone code from a couple weeks ago, and we can note some things right off the bat. The first is that we have to list our dependencies as separate script tags on our own. So we've got jQuery, the Doug Crockford JSON library, underscore, and Backbone all listed out. And I have to know as the developer that, underscore needs to come before Backbone because Backbone relies on an underscore, and Backbone also relies on jQuery. So jQuery needs to come first. And then finally, I've got my own application down here, the app.js file, and I have to put that last because it relies on all of those other things. Additionally, every time I'm adding a new file, I need to add another script tag and keep these dependencies in mind. And I'm responsible for combining these into a single file to optimize once I'm deploying to production and so on. So that's kind of tricky right there. We also see that my template, much like you would see in most JavaScript MVC examples, is just put directly into the HTML and has an ID, and that's how I'm going to retrieve template markup. And then finally, inside app.js, it's kind of a kitchen sink. There's no rhyme or reason to how things are defined in here, how they're organized. Here I'm defining a model, here a collection, and after I'm defining things, I'm just immediately invoking them and using them. So you've got, the application of classes or objects in the same file as the definition of those classes or objects. So that's kind of weird. It feels messy, kind of sloppy. When I want to get the content for that template, I have to just get that tag from jQuery, get the HTML out of that tag, and that's how I build my template function. So this is all just feels a little clunky, a little messy. The one other thing I want to point out is, as is typical in JavaScript applications, this is all wrapped in what's called an immediately invoked anonymous function, which is basically a way of creating a new scope that won't leak out into the global browser environment. This is needed a lot in the browser. Node.js kind of deals with this by saying each file has its own scope and a set of exports that can be created from each file. So this is like kind of standard JavaScript boilerplate, is this immediately invoked anonymous function. So that's kind of the issues that we have with JavaScript without a loader. Now we're going to look at, well, actually real quick, let me show an example of this getting way out of hand in do-gooder. So these are all the components in do-gooder. There's, a lot of them, 60, something like that. And as people were adding things during our week-long sprint when we wrote most of this, they had to look at this and say, oh, where am I going to put this new thing I just wrote? Where does filter go in relation to filter list? The XHR utility is kind of, used by a lot of stuff, so let's put that up near the top. And you're kind of heuristically figuring this out, and it's very messy. So now that you kind of see like the end of this problem, like where it all gets really messy, where you're staring into the abyss and trying to figure out what the hell you've done, let's look at Require.js. Much nicer way of doing things. Every Require.js app is going to have a single script tag up front, generally. And it looks like this. So you've got your source is Require.js, and you've got an HTML5 data attribute here, data main, and then basically the thing that kicks off your application. So if you've ever written, like a C program, this is like your main function here. So you're just telling it, this is how you kick off my app once Require.js is ready to go. You load js/app.js. What does that actually have in it? There's basically two pieces. The first is configuration. So you got to tell Require.js, where do I find the rest of the stuff? And also, if there's anything I'm using that wasn't written with Require.js in mind, how can Require.js understand that thing? So let's step through this piece by piece. First, our base URL, we're just saying all of the JavaScript is going to be in here. If you use a fully qualified URL of some kind, so something that starts with a slash, starts with an HTTP, ends with a .js even, then it's going to assume that's an actual URL and it's not going to use the base. But if you say something like vendor/backbone, it's going to assume that's relative to the base URL. These paths in here are essentially aliases for things in the app. So, in my code, I'm going to be using Backbone a lot. I'm going to be using jQuery a lot. So I don't want to have to write every time I'm using jQuery that I require vendor/jQuery-2.0.3. So I basically give it an alias. That's what this path section is here. And then these shims are basically telling Require.js how to interpret something that wasn't written with it in mind. And that includes underscore and backbone. So I basically tell it, in the case of underscore, the only variable that really ought to be available outside of the library itself is the underscore variable. In the case of backbone, it's the backbone with a capital B variable. And that depends on underscore and jQuery, two other modules in CommonJS or in Require.js. And in doing this, Require.js is able to use third-party stuff that doesn't include support out of the box, which is a nice advantage over something like YUI Loader, where it's kind of its own insular ecosystem. Notice that I'm not making a shim for jQuery, and that's because jQuery for a while now has actually supported Require.js out of the box. So it's getting some good adoption in the wider community. The second part of your data main file, in our case app.js here, is just calling Require.js itself and saying what the dependencies are for the main function. So in this main function, I'm using jQuery, fruit collection, fruit model, and fruit view. And then you'll see that I'm just doing the implementation code. So I don't have to define these things here. I've told it, I'm using these from other files. And then I can just do the implementation or the application of those definitions inside the main function. So whereas in our older implementation here, I was defining it and then immediately instantiating it after the fact. And, having that all kind of mixed up is a little clunky. Whenever you see the new operator, like right next to the definition of something that's being instantiated, it's a sign that things are a little messy, a little sloppy. So now that is separated. My other code is in separate files that define Require.js modules now. So let's take a look at, let's say, the fruit model as an example that we can work off of. We can see that our boilerplate that before included an immediately invoked anonymous function up top is replaced with a call to define, which is a function from Require.js. Our first argument to it is whatever other modules we require. In this case, just Backbone. That's all we need. And those dependencies, or more specifically, whatever was exported from those modules, are passed to a function implementing our module as arguments. So I've said I rely on Backbone here. So the first argument here is the export from the Backbone module. Following that same concept, whatever I return from my function in my module becomes the export for my module. So that's whatever I return here is going to be available for other people to use when they include my module. So that's how the app.js function here knows, okay, this person says they rely on models/fruit. That's going to mean they get access to that constructor that was defined in that module, because that's what was returned from it. If I wanted to return multiple things instead of just a single function or whatever, I could return an object that defined multiple exports of some kind. And then people could reference those however they want. But ultimately, it's a single value of some kind, an object, a function, an integer, whatever, that is exported from that module and therefore available to other modules. So let's look at a couple of our other files real quick here. Now we'll look at the fruit collection that's going to show us an additional concept. So in this case, we need Backbone, but because we're referencing the fruit model directly on line 7 there, when we're saying what model does this collection manage, we also rely directly on the fruit model, and we have to put that in our dependency array. And then finally, let's look at our view, because that's got an interesting concept that's different from the original version of this application. First, we require Backbone, of course, because we're defining a view. But then second, we're going to load a template from an external HTML file. And you'll notice a little bit of weird syntax here. I'm saying text, exclamation point, and then the path to the template. That's because if I didn't have this text exclamation point at the beginning, Require.js would assume that this was JavaScript code and it should be executed and interpreted as soon as it was loaded. And that's not what we want in this case. Instead, this text exclamation point tells it to pass it along to this plugin for Require.js called Require Text. And that's just going to return the content as a variable. So instead of having it defined in a script tag with a weird type attribute on it, we just get it as the contents of this template content variable. So in the background, Require.js is asynchronously retrieving Backbone if it needs to, and retrieving the content of this HTML file, and then putting that in these variables for me. So when I'm passing this along to the underscore template engine, I just give it that variable template content. So that's different than our original version here, where I had to grab that out of the DOM. So, you can imagine as the application's getting bigger to something like do-gooder, it's not really feasible to put all your templates in script tags like this. You need them in external files. And it's also a lot nicer for whoever might be writing that HTML. So if you've got a designer involved, or maybe just multiple front-end engineers working on this project, it's nicer for them to work in these separate files where they just have these HTML snippets instead of having everything kind of crammed into one huge HTML file with inline script tags. So that's a really nice advantage there. And then again, you just see I'm just returning the result of backbone.view.extend. So I'm basically saying this view definition should be available to other people who might want to use this module. So then if we go back to app.js.
Brent,
Yeah,
can you go back to the JavaScript you were just in there?
the view.
Yes, that one. I
Mhm.
notice on line 7 you're using the underscore variable there, but not declaring it as a dependency here. Is that because it's inherited? Like it can go back, I guess it's defined as an application dependency? Is that
No,
how that works?
that is a bug in this case. Like I should actually have this. The only reason I'm not getting bit by that is underscore is not actually a require.js module. So it is putting stuff into the global scope itself.
Right. Okay.
So I actually was lucky in that case because as you remember here, like I just made a shim for underscore, so require.js understood what I was doing.
Hmm.
But in reality, underscore exports that variable itself into the global scope.
Okay,
So
that makes sense.
that's why that was working. Yeah.
Thanks.
Yep. Um, so other than that, this looks just like our original app. Like it's very recognizable. I'm just saying we've got a fruit collection. We're pulling from the server. We're going to render that with the fruits view, and then we're going to append that to a wrapper with jQuery. So basically, this just allows you to do what you would do in PHP, like really separate things out. So you've got like one defined object per file. Your files that are in nice folders like this, where you can kind of see how things are structured and you know where to look for something. And require.js is going to make sure that it's doing all of the loading for that in a way that doesn't block further execution and rendering of the page. So it works really nicely in the browser. So before we wrap up or go on to questions, I'll just run the app real quick and look at the network tab. So we can see, require.js has loaded these uh, dependencies for me in the background. It's in a slightly odd order, like I've got fruit.js, the collection, the model, and then down here underscore JS. And that seems a little weird, but that's just because require.js can load these in any order, and then it's not going to execute the functions that actually define that module until it knows it has its dependencies ready. So it can fire off requests in parallel, making the page load a lot faster and be more responsive without any risk. Whereas when you're doing this manually, like in the no loader version here, I have to order these things on my own, and each script tag is um, a blocking operation. So until jQuery is fully loaded and executed and parsed, it's not going to move on to try to load JSON 2. So I'm going to have a slower page. And that's why, for example, people have started putting their script tags down here in the footer, because when you had them up in the header instead, you were blocking the entire rendering of the page. So require.js goes an extra step and says it'll load everything asynchronously for you and then run the code when it knows it has the dependencies available. So that's a pretty cool benefit right there. Uh, on top of that, we can tell um, require.js to combine all of these things into a single file using a Node.js script that they ship with it called RJS. That'll help optimize your modules into a single file for deployment without you having to think about that again. So that's really a much better way of dealing with large JavaScript applications versus doing what we originally did with Jupyter. So that's basically it. Any questions? All right. So I will post notes in the next day or two here, like I've been doing, and post the recording of this. And I think this is something that should be pretty easy to use in any project you're working on. I think it will definitely be used in TimeKit. So that might be the first place that we see it if anyone wants to play around with that. It'll probably start popping up in TimeKit tomorrow, actually.
Will
So
that actually speed up do-gooder?
it would definitely speed up do-gooder, yes.
Yeah, because that's part of the lag is all those JavaScript files. Like you said, they're all linear loading each other. Or
Yeah,
sequentially.
that's basically the initial page load is a little slower.
Yeah.
Moving around the app, not really, but
But it's going to help the dependency craziness.
yeah, it definitely makes things more maintainable. I mean, it's really nice seeing a JavaScript application structured nicely like this, like you would expect on the server, instead of your typical JavaScript, which is, I've got several libraries I depend on, but then after that, I've got a giant junk drawer that I've thrown all the code for the project in. Like in our WordPress stuff, it's always like fx.js and messy things like that. So this is a huge improvement, just maintainability wise.
Cool.
All right. Thanks, guys. I think that's about it.
Thanks, Brad.
Cool. See ya.
Thanks, Brad. Bye bye.